Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 71, the first Anglo-Australian girl to be married in Australia. Rebecca Small was born in Port Jackson on the 22nd of September 1789. She was the eldest daughter of John Small and Mary Parker, and she is thought to be the first Anglo-Australian born girl to be married in Australia and the oldest living white Australian at the time of her death, aged 93 in 1883. There was a recollection that said Rebecca Small, Mrs. Francis Oakes, told me that she was born in a room at the rear of the governor's residence in Pitt Street, where the Union Bank is now. Governor Phillip at first lived in a marquee near the cove until his residence was erected. Rebecca was baptised on the 24th of October 1789 at the Church of England in Sydney. Her father, John Small, was born in Birmingham, England in December 1761. At the age of 19, his occupation was a bitmaker, and he entered the 33rd Company of the Plymouth Division of the Marine Corps at Birmingham on the 16th of April 1781. In mid-June 1781, he embarked on the HMS Lively and arrived at Sandy Hook and then New York in September. The Lively was then sent back to England a month later with dispatches for the Admiralty, but it suffered much damage during the voyage. It took 7 months before the repairs were done on the Lively, and then John joined them bound on a voyage to the West Indies with dispatches expressed to Sir George, arriving at Barbados in July 1782. After a couple of months in the Caribbean, the Lively was then ordered back to New York. It was taken over by American rebel prisoners, and John Small was held prisoner in Cuba for 4 to 7 months. After peace was signed in 1783, John and other English prisoners were exchanged for Spanish prisoners, and he eventually got back to Port Plymouth in August 1783. He then embarked on the HMS Diamond, where he was shown on the muster on the 21st of August 1783 to be discharged the next day. So it seems after his discharge from the Marine Service, he went off the rails a little bit as he became a highwayman. John was tried at the Devon Lent Assizes held at Exeter Castle on the 14th of March 1785, and it said Stephen Davenport, John Herbert, Robert Elwood and John Small, charged with feloniously assaulting James Burt in the King's Highway, feloniously putting him into corporal fear and danger of his life, and feloniously and violently taking from his person and against his will in the said highway 1 metal watch, a tortoiseshell case valued at 30 shillings, 1 pruning knife valued at 6 pence, and 5 shillings of goods. They were all found guilty and sentenced to be hanged. However, royal mercy was extended on Herbert and John Small for transportation for 7 years, possibly because of John's previous service in the Marines. John Small was transported aboard the ship the Charlotte, and on his arrival into the new colony, John was employed in the laboratory tent at Port Jackson. But in July 1788, he was removed from his work when he and a number of others were found drunk on hospital wine. He was charged with this offence, but he was acquitted due to a lack of evidence. He was transferred to the site of the construction of the redoubt on the eastern side of the cove. He actually became Captain Phillip's personal servant, and he was known to be trustworthy and of a gentlemanly manner while he was in service. John Small married Mary Parker on the 12th of October 1788 in Sydney. Mary Parker had been born in 1759. On the 26th of April 1786, she was tried for burglary. And it stated that Mary Parker was indicted for burglariously and feloniously breaking and entering into the dwelling of John Hickman at 11 p.m. on the 19th of April 1786 and stealing 2 muslin gowns and coats, a cotton gown, 3 cotton frocks, a calico bedgown, 4 pairs of cotton pockets, 11 shirts, 1 shift and 1 diaper clout. One of the residents of the home said, "I knew her. She had lived with Mr. Hickman before. I asked her what she was at and she gave me no answer. I said to her, 'Molly, "What do you mean to come here to rob your mistress again?" And I said, "Come, bundle out of the room." She set off to come out of the room, and she stooped to put her shoes on, which were off. I stood by the door and caught hold of her gown tail, and she asked me in the passage to let her go out, and I told her no. Mary had been a servant in this lodging house, and she was charged previously with the theft of 2 tablecloths and was sentenced to 6 months in the House of Corrections at Clerkenwell. After her release, she returned to this lodging house, and she was found by this resident hiding in a garret. She said that she'd gone there to get a character reference from a resident. However, they thought that she'd come to steal the washing that was hanging there. This was enough to find her guilty, and she was sentenced to 7 years transportation of a lesser charge of stealing and not of burglary. Mary Parker was held at Newgate Prison for 8 months before being transported on the ship the Lady Penrhyn on the 6th of January 1787. Her duties as a convict are unknown, but it is possible that she was employed as a domestic at Government House, and that is where she would have met John Small. She also had been a prison nurse back in England, so she could likely have been working at the hospital that John had been working in when he first arrived in the colony. Mary's term of service did not expire until April 1792. John Small became known as the Sergeant in the colony, and in February 1794 he received a grant of 30 acres at Eastern Farms that he had called Small's Farm. In January 1810, John Small petitioned the Governor. He wrote, "The humble petition of John Small, a constable and a settler at Kissing Point, that your Excellency's petitioner begs to state that he has been in this colony upwards of 20 years, has a large family of a wife and 7 children, which he has supported by extensive industry, and in consequence of his land nearly being exhausted by constant tillage, His Honour Lieutenant Governor Patterson was pleased to grant him 30 acres more, and it was further His Honour's intention to give the petitioner another addition had His Honour remained in the command. The petitioner humbly hopes your Excellency will in your goodness confirm this said grant, and shall be exerted the approbation of your Excellency by a continuance of conduct in which he has hitherto practised." On the 8th of April 1824, Mary drowned at Kissing Point on their property, and an inquest was held, and the verdict was drowned by accident in a 7-foot deep waterhole. The inquest details say that Mary was walking near a large waterhole close to which was a footpath. She missed her footing and fell into the water of the large hole, and then drowned and instantly died. Her son John attested that at 6 p.m. he was at his brother William's house when his wife asked him to fetch a pail of water. John and William walked to the well. As they approached the well, they could see 2 shoes and a woman's cap floating on the surface. William stooped and got out one of the shoes and said that he feared it was his mother's. John stayed at the well whilst William ran to the house and found that his mother had been from home for some time. Whilst his brother was gone, John got a pole and raised a female to the surface and found it to be his mother. Efforts to revive her were without effect. She was 66 years, and Mary had been seen at 2 p.m. by her son Samuel, who lived with her. When the coroner asked what state Mary had been in lately, her son said at times she appeared childish, but he supposed it was infirmity of old age. John Small and Mary Parker had 7 children in total, and in 1825 John started to receive a pension after 17 years as District Constable for Kissing Point. In 1828, John is listed as a publican, living at Kissing Point with a land grant total of 40 acres, with 44 cattle and 350 sheep, and John Small died in October 1850, aged 89. So their daughter Rebecca married Reverend Francis Oakes on the 27th of January 1806, and as mentioned, this is thought to be the first marriage of an Anglo-Australian born child from the First Fleet in Australia. Francis Oakes had come free on the Nautilus in May 1798. Francis was born in April 1770 in Warwickshire, England, and he was 19 years older than Rebecca. He was a shoemaker by trade, but he was also a member of the Congregational Church, and he volunteered as an artisan missionary to go to the South Seas on the ship the Duff in 1796. He was sent out by the London Missionary Society, and it was the first enterprise of its kind to visit the Southern Hemisphere. He was stationed at Tahiti, They were unsuccessful at Tahiti because of faction wars amongst the native population, and eventually came to the newly formed colony in New South Wales on the 14th of May 1798. So on Francis's arrival in Sydney, he accepted a grant of 100 acres at Dundas, and he virtually abandoned his missionary vocation to be a landowner. He was one of the missionaries referred to by contemporaries as having dishonoured his calling by moral defection, though he later supported religious work in the colony. In 1799, Governor Hunter made a further land grant to Francis of 100 acres, which he called Langford Farm, and in 1804 there was another 50 acres added. Francis also built a home in Parramatta on the present Church and Phillip Streets. There was an article referring to the farm of Francis. In January 1804, a shocking accident by fire took place at Pennant Hills on the farm of Mr. Oakes. The barn was totally reduced to ashes, with its whole contents, which is said to have been considerable. During the whole course of the disaster, a servant of Mr. Hassell's, whose name was Earl, was conspicuously diligent in his exertions to extinguish the flames and to save the property from being consumed. The poor fellow was burnt to death whilst endeavouring to save the stock from being destroyed. The extreme regret felt by Mr. and Mrs. Hassell upon this occasion is difficult to be conceived. So the Hassells lived next door, and they obviously were very good friends with the Oakeses, as some of their children actually have Hassell as part of their name. And interestingly, when Francis and Rebecca married by Samuel Marsden, Roland Hassell and Hannah Crook signed the register. In August 1805, Francis was appointed Chief Constable for Parramatta, and this led him to the involvement with the MacArthur Bligh wrangle and the rum racket. He gave evidence at the official investigation into the conduct of Darcy Wentworth, and he was also sent to arrest John MacArthur for refusing to attend the inquiry concerning the schooner Parramatta, and lodged a deposition against MacArthur, who had resisted arrest. Oakes's report resulted in the immediate criminal prosecution of MacArthur, who had blamed Francis Oakes for misconstruing his conversation. During the rebel administration, Oakes was dismissed from office, and he was one of the settlers who petitioned the Colonial Office in alarm at the condition of the colony. He was chosen by Bligh as a witness to attend Lieutenant Colonel Johnston's court-martial, and he sailed to England with Bligh in May 1810. He returned to New South Wales on the Mary in May 1812 and resumed his duties. As well as his duties as Chief Constable, Oakes was also a baker, a shopkeeper, a contractor, an inspector of slaughtering houses, a clerk of the public market, and an auctioneer. He owned property farmland near Binder that he farmed with his sons, called the Oakes. Francis Oakes was one of the few Australians whose effigy had been publicly burnt. When Bligh was arrested in 1808 and his effigy was burnt in Sydney on Church Hill, one of Oakes's was likewise set ablaze on the riverbank at Parramatta by the supporters of the New South Wales Corps. Francis Oakes was also the superintendent of the female factory at Parramatta from 1814 to 1822. He was known as an honest, steady citizen, though an index to his character is given in a story that when asked if he would swear to the truth of a certain statement, he replied, "Oh yes, I'll chance it." He did not have the entire approbation of his religious colleagues. William Crook found him to be a bold, rough creature, and John Dunmore Lang averred that he was known locally as a settler, a chief constable, an auctioneer, and a scoundrel. In the 1828 census, the Oakes family held a total of 1,250 acres of land at Parramatta. On the 30th of January 1883, Rebecca passed away, and it was stated Mrs. Rebecca Oakes, relict of Mr. Francis Oakes, supposed to be the oldest white Australian, died at her residence Parramatta, aged 94. Mrs. Oakes was born in Sydney at the Old Government House, being the second white female born in the colony, and was prior to her death the oldest Australian native living. She was the mother of a family of 14 children, 6 of whom are still alive. And you'll note there that it mentions that she was the second white female born in the colony. In episode 68, the research that I did means there's 2 ahead of her, so she could very well have been in the first handful of babies born in the colony, but from my research, not quite the second. Mrs. Oakes was much respected by a large circle of friends in Parramatta and district. During her life, she gained lasting fame as a philanthropist and a true friend of the poor and afflicted. For some years past, Mrs. Oakes has been more or less an invalid, but her last illness was very brief, and to the end of her life she retained the use of her faculties. To all those who are familiar with Parramatta, and to the many beyond that locality, the deceased lady was well known and esteemed. Those who are best acquainted with her know how gentle her spirit was, how charitable was her disposition, and how devout and blameless her life. Mrs. Oakes will live in the affections of a large circle of connections, and many beyond that circle will be sorry to hear that this venerable lady has passed away. Anne Francis Oakes died on the 15th of February 1884 at his residence in Parramatta, aged 74. It's stated that he was one of the oldest colonists, arriving 44 years ago. Their children. The firstborn was Elizabeth Oakes, and she was born on the 26th of December 1806 in Parramatta. Elizabeth married John Armstrong when she was 19 and John 32 in September 1826 at Parramatta. John was born in England in 1793 and he arrived in New South Wales in November 1825. So they married within 8 months of his arrival. He was recruited as a surveyor in England by the Australian Agricultural Company, and he sailed to Australia on board the ship Brothers. Their first child was born in Parramatta, and not long after the birth of their first child, they moved to Port Stephens, where John was to undertake survey work on the Newcastle town and coal facilities, again on behalf of the Australian Agricultural Company. On the 16th of July 1832, John Armstrong completed his term of service with the Australian Agricultural Company, and he began to advertise to continue his work as a surveyor. On the 4th of November 1833, he was employed to accompany the government surveyor in the final accurate markings of locations selected at Liverpool Plains. John Armstrong died in 1870, and it says this gentleman, who died at his residence Macquarie Street at the advanced age of 78, was by profession a surveyor. He arrived in this city 45 years ago in that capacity and resided at Port Stephens for a few years and ultimately settled in Sydney. He has been, until 6 months ago, busily employed by the government in laying out and mapping extensive districts in the colony. Mr. Armstrong assisted in planning the necropolis at Haslam's Creek. He was always esteemed by professional men and the public in general as one of the most accurate and trustworthy surveyors in the colony. He spared no pains to make his plans and descriptions clear, correct and comprehensive. He was a man of high moral and religious principles, of singular modesty and very courteous manners. To his large family connections he was greatly endeared, and he has left behind him an example which memory will not easily forget. They had 8 children together, and Elizabeth died at Wallara, New South Wales in October 1880, aged 73. The next child of Francis Oakes and Rebecca Small was Anne Oakes, and she was born on the 6th of September 1808 at Gosford, New South Wales. She married William Burns in December 1834 in Parramatta when she was 26. William Burns was born himself at Parramatta in 1809. William Burns' father, James Sr., was a member of the New South Wales Corps. He was apprenticed to Richard Hunt, the saddler, and then he later associated with his brother James in various enterprises. In 1841, James and William Burns leased some land that was owned by William MacArthur near the old government store and commenced to erect a steam flour mill. The mill was completed towards the end of 1841 and began to grind wheat into flour. In 1845, the firm announced its intention of erecting, alongside the flour mill, a cloth factory, and that it had sent to England to procure the necessary machinery. Early in 1846, the building used as a cloth mill was completed, and in September the machinery arrived. They manufactured lama cloth, tweeds, checks, doe skins, kerseymires and clan tartans. The tartans were the first made in the colony. The cloth mill was 5 stories high and initially employed 39 persons. They then purchased a plant at Granville, and the original site of the mill was part of George Street. It was used for many years to house the aged and infirmed men. William and his brother started one of the first steam ferries to run on the Parramatta River. They were highly successful until the gold rush of the 1850s, which drained the area of workers and forced them to close their mills in 1857. And upon the death of William Burns, an obituary stated, "Another old, widely known and highly respected colonist is dead. The Honorary William Burns, MLC, died yesterday at his residence at George Street, Parramatta, from influenza." Mr. William Burns was the oldest member of the Legislative Council, having been appointed by the Cowper Ministry in 1857. And in his later years, he was a constant attendant at the chamber. He was one of the oldest Freemasons in the colony, and it was at one time a magistrate of the territory. He leaves a family of 6 sons and 5 daughters. His eldest son, Mr. James Burns, is an alderman and a magistrate at Wilcannia. One of their daughters they actually named Australia. Anne and William had 14 children, 13 of those survived infancy, and Anne died in Gosford in October 1880, aged 72. Their third child, Mary Oakes, was born in Parramatta in August 1810. She married Reverend John Hutchinson at St John's, Parramatta in May 1826, when she was 15 and John was 33. John had been born in England and he was brought up in the Church of England, but against his parents' wishes, he turned to the Methodist Church, where he felt that he could do more good. He left London on the brig Anne that reached Hobart on the 16th of May 1823. He served as a local preacher at Hobart for 5 months, and then he proceeded to Sydney. He worked for 15 months in Sydney, at which time he became friendly with Francis Oakes and met his daughter Mary, who was 14 at the time. He was then sent to Launceston and arrived on the ship St Michael in March 1825. A year later, he returned to Sydney. John Hutchinson was publicly ordained as a Methodist minister and a missionary. He was the first Wesleyan minister to be ordained in Sydney, and 7 days after his ordination, he married Mary. As a newly married couple, they went to Tonga, and John became very ill 6 weeks after arriving there. So remember Mary's age when they married. So she was only 16 when she accompanied John to Tonga. Several years were spent in Tonga under hazardous conditions. There was opposition of the chief, as well as John Hutchinson's ill health, that made it imperative for the couple to return to Sydney. And it was not until May 1828 that they returned to Sydney. And just a little side note, there was a death notice for one of their children, Francis Howe, that died at the age of 2 years and 3 weeks in 1829. And there was an interesting note in that death notice. It says, "This child, who was born on the island of Tonga Taboo, being the firstborn of English natives, and on that account he was named by the Tongese after one of their greatest divinities." John was stationed at Windsor for 2 years and then received an appointment to Hobart Town, arriving there in January 1830. John pursued an active ministry in Hobart, but his health was not good, and when he was appointed to Macquarie Harbour, he objected to the transfer due to the inclement weather in the area, but it was to no avail, so he resigned from the Wesleyan ministry. In January 1832, they were offered positions at the Female House of Corrections at Hobart Town. And while John was the superintendent of the Female House of Correction in Hobart, Mary, at that stage only 22, was appointed matron. So she had the special responsibility for the health and the behaviour of the inmates. It was a challenging job and made even more difficult by the explosion of numbers of transported women in the 1830s and 1840s. And of course, she was frequently bearing her own children, as well as dealing with her husband's persistent ill health and resulting incompetence in his role. Bored, hungry women proved difficult to manage. There was little for them to do but washing and sewing. The living conditions were appalling and the diet was limited and inadequate. There was lack of citrus fruit, little sunlight, damp conditions, overcrowding, and a practice of weaning and separating babies from their mothers at an early age aggravated the appalling conditions. Mary Hutchinson tried to provide wet nurses when available to decrease the amount of infant mortality. So not only were there children of female convicts dying in quite large numbers, unfortunately half of John and Mary's children also succumbed. Mary and John had 16 children, 10 of which though died in infancy or childhood. So John Hutchinson was actually the longest-serving superintendent of any female factory in Australia. So when he was appointed in January 1832, he took over the Cascades factory, and at that point it was less than 3 years after it had opened, and he remained in charge until 1851. And in John's time at the female factory, it said he lacked the vision of a prison reformer, but he seemed to have been an honest and dutiful administrator who focused his attention on the daily struggles involved in managing an overcrowded and underfunded institution. John was forced to resign in 1851, though, due to his health problems, and then Mary was transferred to be the officer in charge of the Female House of Correction in Launceston. She was a woman in a public role in a controversial institution, and she became the target of intense criticism over the factory's shortcomings. She was accused of failing to reduce the death rate amongst the babies and children, and she was also accused of rarely inspecting conditions in the yards. She did, however, introduce improvements in sleeping quarters, better accommodation for children, looms to provide gainful occupation, and a points system to encourage the development of good habits, a position she held until she retired in 1854. And Reverend John Hutchinson died on the 7th of May, 1866. Mary died in February 1880 in Hobart, aged 70. The fourth child, George, was born in August 1813 in Parramatta. He married Mary Ann Shelley in Parramatta in May 1837 when he was 23 and Mary 20. He followed pastoral and agricultural pursuits and bought land within the 19 counties in the 1840s with his brother Francis as partner. He lived near Goulburn for a time but made his headquarters at Parramatta, where he became a member of the District Council in 1842 and was active in getting a water supply for the town. He was on the committees of the local Benevolent Asylum and District Hospital. He had a house in Parramatta, an orangery with 2,500 orange trees, and an estate, Oak Park, that was 1,900 acres. In the 1850s, he had 4 runs in the Wellington district, which amounted to 132,500 acres, and it was capable of carrying 3,500 cattle. In the 1860s, he also held his runs in partnership with J. Josephson, and by 1871, he had 5 runs in the Bligh and Wellington districts. And in August 1881, records the death of Honorary George Oakes, MLC. We regret to have to chronicle the fact that Honorary George Oakes, MLC, one of the best known and most respected of our colonists, met with an accident on Wednesday in the Elizabeth Street tramway, which terminated in his death. The honorary gentleman had been attending to his parliamentary duties and left the Legislative Council chamber about 6 p.m, intending to take the tram to Redfern and proceed by train to Parramatta. After he arrived at the tramway office in Elizabeth Street, a tram from Waverley passed in the direction of Hunter Street. This tram was followed by a short distance by another, which had also arrived from Waverley. Both trams had stopped at the corner of Elizabeth and King Streets, allowing passengers to alight. Mr. Oakes seemed to have been unaware of the fact that 2 trams were so close to the terminus. When the first had passed the office, he stepped onto the up line and looked towards Hunter Street in order to see whether the Redfern tram was approaching. Immediately, Mr. Oakes stepped between the rails and the second tram from Waverley came upon him. The people who were standing about shouted to him, and the fireman of the motor pushed him off the line. Mr. Oakes fell with great force upon the asphalt road and fractured the base of his skull. There was a considerable hemorrhage from the wound, and it would seem that when the fireman pushed Mr. Oakes off the line, one of the feet of the latter tripped, for after he was picked up, it was found that the heel of one of his boots had been crushed and the boot stripped from the foot. Mr. Oakes was picked up by the conductor of the second Waverley train. He was sensible for a short time, during which he requested the conductor to put his boot on. A stretcher was obtained and the unfortunate gentleman removed to the infirmary. By this stage he was quite unconscious, with blood flowing from his left ear. It was seemed he would not live very long. An inquest on Thursday was held and returned the verdict to the effect that the death arose from injuries accidentally received. George and Mary had 5 children, and only 2 of them lived into older adulthood. The 5th child, Rebecca Jr., was born in April 1815 in Parramatta. She married John George Richardson when she was 17, in February 1833 at St John's, Parramatta. John Richardson had been born in England and he was 12 years older than Rebecca. In 1835, John received an 80-acre land grant at Camden. In 1842, he was listed as having a shop in George Street, Sydney. In about 1844, they moved to England and John died in London in October 1845. Rebecca and John had 3 children. Rebecca was only 30 when John died, and she returned to Sydney when she married Robert Muriel in January 1850 at St James's, Sydney, at the age of 34. Robert Muriel was 5 years younger than Rebecca. They had 5 children together, and by the 1880s they had moved to England, and Rebecca died at Hampstead, London, at the age of 89 in December 1904. The 6th child, Susanna Hassel Oakes, was born in September 1816 in Parramatta. She married James Sprent in March 1837 at St John's in Parramatta when she was 20 and James 30. James Sprent was born in Manchester, England. He was the son of a publisher from Glasgow. He sailed from Liverpool on the Norval and arrived at Hobart Town in May 1830, bringing a large investment in books, engravings and stationery worth £1,200. In Liverpool Street, he soon opened a public house for young gentlemen, and by 1832 he began classes for young ladies and adults after school hours and lectured on astronomy at the Mechanics' Institute. He then moved his academy to a cottage at Mount Pleasant. Soon afterwards this closed and he applied for a free land grant but was rejected by the Colonial Office in spite of his capital and his claim that when he left England his ultimate intention was to establish himself on the land. In August 1833, Sprent was appointed as a temporary assistant surveyor. In 3 years, he surveyed much of the southeastern half of Van Diemen's Land. In March 1838, he was then made a permanent assistant surveyor, and by 1847 was appointed as a first-class assistant surveyor. In June 1857, he was appointed chief surveyor and acting surveyor general, and his own map of Tasmania was completed by 1859 in great detail. Early in 1859, Sprent's health became impaired. He ceased duty as Surveyor General and the Commissioner of Crown Lands and was given a pension, and he died at his home in Warwick Street, Hobart, in September 1863, aged only 55. Sprent was resourceful, intelligent, and was known to be an excellent bushman. They had 9 children together. 3 of their children died in the scarlet fever epidemic in 1853, and another child died in childhood as well. Susanna died in January 1907 in Hobart, aged 90. The 7th child, Francis Roland Oakes, was born in March 1818 in Parramatta. He married Elizabeth Laurie in Auckland, New Zealand in January 1845. They had 1 daughter, Rebecca. Elizabeth died in 1857, aged only 33, and Francis went on to marry Eliza Raybone in May 1858 in Gosford, New South Wales, when Francis was 40 and Eliza 22. They had 4 children, 3 of whom survived infancy. Francis was a member of the New South Wales Parliament and he died at his property, Woodlands at Gosford, in August 1866 at the age of only 48. Their 8th child, Lucy, was born in November 1819 in Gosford and she died in February 1828 at Gosford, aged only 8 years old. Their 9th child, Roland Hassel Oakes, was born in June 1821 in Gosford. He married Frances Harding Mansfield, known as Fanny, in Sydney in May 1847 when Roland was 25 and Fanny 18. Roland held some land in Bathurst, New South Wales, and they had 7 children, 6 who survived infancy. Fanny died in Bathurst in 1875 and Roland went on to marry Minnie Dowling Wilkinson in New South Wales in April 1885. However, Roland died on the 20th of April 1888 at his property, Bunamooga, near Rockley, aged 66. And an inquest was held at Bathurst, as the verdict on this inquest was that Roland had shot himself while suffering from temporary insanity. The 10th child, Samuel Oakes, was born in October 1822 in Parramatta, but he died aged only 17 days old. The 11th child, James Laurie Oakes, was born in September 1824 in Parramatta. He married Frances Eliza Dargan, known as Fanny, in Windsor, New South Wales, in February 1851, when he was 26 and Fanny 18. They had one daughter, and James died at Kelso, New South Wales, aged only 28, in August 1853. The 12th child, John Lee Oakes, was born in May 1826 in Goulburn. He married Elizabeth Mary Shelley in Sydney in April 1848. In 1855, Francis Oakes Sr. transferred the 640-acre property known as Kangaloola Swamp, a portion of the Funny Hill property, to his son John for £500, and the property became the family home for many years, and it was named Kenilworth. John Lee Oakes was a Justice of the Peace and a magistrate, and he made many appearances in court, particularly as there was a high incidence of cattle and horse stealing in the Crookall and Goulburn areas. They had 10 children together. Only 5 of those children survived into adulthood. In October 1882, John Lee Oakes was exhibiting signs of eccentric behaviour. He was charged with having obtained money by falsely representing 2 cheques totalling £10 to a businessman in Goulburn, and he then proceeded to Sydney, where he was later arrested and brought back to Goulburn for trial. It was a curious thing for someone in his position to do, and the defence argued that he was suffering from insanity when he committed the offence. One of his nephews gave evidence and said that several of the prisoner's relatives have had to have been kept under restraint, showing a family tendency to the malady. And you can see that with his older brothers particularly, they died at quite a young age. So maybe mental illness was a lot to do with their deaths. The prisoner, it was supposed, had inherited the failing, as latterly his conduct had been very peculiar, and he appeared to labour under the delusion that he would become possessed of a fortune. Before coming to Goulburn, he'd become so eccentric in his manner that he on several occasions had taken a candle and walked into Crookall from Binder at night with a distance of 12 miles. However, the medical officer of Darlinghurst Jail gave his opinion that Oakes was perfectly sane. The jury agreed with this, and Oakes was found guilty of false pretences. Because his health was not good, his lawyer asked if he would not be sentenced to hard labour and be confined in a jail where the climate was colder than that of Goulburn, so he was imprisoned in the Queanbeyan jail for 12 months. It seems likely that this incarceration increased his eccentric behaviour, as his last years were very difficult for his family. He had been admitted to the Hospital for the Insane at Rydalmere, and he died on the 27th of April 1901 of maniacal exhaustion and pneumonia when he was 77. He's buried in the same grave as his father, Francis, at St John's Church in Parramatta. One of their children became an archdeacon, and he gave reminiscences in an article, and he said the Oakes family had grants of land on the Crookall River near Binder, 43 miles from Goulburn. The original homestead on our property was burnt down by a gang of ex-convicts under the leadership of a man named Whitten, who was afterwards hanged at Goulburn. They first shot an assigned servant engaged with others in harvesting. Francis Oakes Jr. rode into Goulburn and, accompanied by a party of police, followed the outlaws for some days. A fight ensued and one of the bushrangers was shot and the others captured. The dead man was strapped to a horse, which was entrusted to the care of a terrified black tracker who allowed the horse to escape. It stampeded through the bush for some days and was eventually found with its gruesome burden still securely fastened to the saddle. John Gilbert, locally known as Happy Jack because he was always whistling, was employed as a horsebreaker at the Oakes property, Oak Park, and was once met with a serious accident. He was kindly treated by John's wife, to whom he was always most grateful, and when he was at the height of his bushranging career with Ben Hall and Dunn, he sent her a message by his old mate the mailman saying that she would never be molested. He faithfully kept his word, although it was known that the gang once camped and had a quart of tea within a quarter of a mile of the homestead. The 13th child, Martha, was born in June 1828 in Gosford. She married Joseph Tertius West, a widow, in April 1867 when she was 38 and Joseph 43. Joseph was one of the most extensive squatters in the Lachlan, with his brothers Major and John West, holding several very large stations about the district. They didn't have any children, and Martha died in Forbes, New South Wales in March 1910 at the age of 81. And the youngest child, William Henry Oakes, was born in August 1831 at Parramatta. He married Harriet Walsh at Bathurst in 1858. William was an auctioneer. William and Harriet had 4 children. 3 of those children died in the 1 year in 1865 of scarlet fever, and their other child, a daughter, had died previously in 1863 as an infant. This left them with no surviving descendants. William died at his property, Oaklands, at Kelso, in April 1881, aged only 49. So it seems the men in the family died quite young. However, the women in the family lived to a very old age for the time.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.